that is a mistake, but most of us believe it. So, would you pull this up for me for a second?
Yeah, definitely.
I'm just going to do Here we go. I've got a whiteboard and I left it in the car. Sorry about that. But most of us have this idea that here's God and here's me, okay? And what happens is we feel like if I do something good, what happens? I move closer to God, right? I volunteer to be seen before. Oh, that moves you right up there. But you know what I'm talking about, right? So you do something good, you move closer to God, but you do something wrong, and what do you feel like? You're moving further away. Okay? And so what's going on with that? Okay, let's just take a moment. You're God, okay? And this is me, and I do something right, and I get closer. You start wrong, rob a liquor store. That's always bad. You back up. Start going back to church. Decide to be junior religious. Move closer. And can you see? So who's doing all the movement? I am. So God is essentially powerless. God is like a lump of clay in this whole thing. It's all about me, right? And that's why this is wrong. So the truth is different. The truth is, because God has made it so, we are already connected. And what can happen, thank you, Senor, thank you very much.
Sure, I wanted to see the picture.
What happens is that we have to start understanding that just because we don't always feel close to God, any of you remember playing peekaboo or seeing people play peekaboo with kids? It's such an exciting game, and it's kind of a dangerous game before they have object permanence. Because, there's mom, and then where'd she go? And they get all excited, right? Because they believe that you've disappeared when they can't see you. But as they grow, they begin to understand that even though they can't see you, you're still there. And so one of the things that is going on in the wilderness is we are learning how to see and walk with God when we don't have that ability to see as closely as we once did. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like, it can feel to us like God's presence is obscured. But has God gone away? No, right? And can you see how dangerous it is to think this is all about us? Because then we're always in this self-improvement thing. We're always trying to guess what's on God's mind, right? And so this idea of understanding the wilderness has to do with how we are able to be in a relationship with God because God has made it so. If this were up to us, it wouldn't be possible. But because God is God, God has chosen to be in a relationship with us. And one of the things that Israel understood was that they were in a relationship with God. Now, they were living in a time when people believed in many different gods, polytheism. And we don't really quite understand polytheism, but polytheism was sort of like, if somebody said to us, oh, I'm a member of the Presbyterian Church, and I'm on the library board at Westerly Library, and I volunteer over at the hospital, and I play cards one night. We wouldn't think that's odd at all, right? Well, for polytheists, that's how they saw worshiping different gods. So they didn't see it as any problem to have lots and lots of gods, because that's just what you did. But Israel said, no, we have an exclusive relationship with the one God. And so that's this understanding of how Israel comes into relationship with this one God. The stories of Israel are basically about how that happens and how they develop this relationship. Now, what we know is that the Exodus happened in Israel when it comes after these powerful displays of God's providential support. There are the miracles in Egypt, there's the escape from Egypt, there's the safe passage through the sea. And so what happens is then they wander for 40 years. And, whether that was a literal 40 years, we don't know, but one thing we do know is it was a good long time. And in that process, they are changed. Because the very nature of the wilderness experience is that we are changed by it. Now, we've been in Lent, we read that fabulous story of how Jesus is baptized and receives this beautiful identity from God. You are my beloved. And he comes out of the water in the sense of, Jesus is told, you are my beloved child. And then what happens is we're told that he was literally pressed or, I don't even know which word I want to use, but they use different ones, but the idea that he was compelled into this wilderness experience of...
driven also.
Driven, right. Very powerful language for that. And what happens in the desert is Jesus, who has been told who he is, okay, now in that time of testing is finding out through the choices he makes how to electively engage in his identity that God has given him and to grow in that identity. In other words, he learns what his mission is and what his mission is not, right? Because so much of our life is about not only making the choices that we make end up being so significant. And one of the things that we see in the story of Israel is that they make all these choices. And it's funny, to read the text. They're at first they're so grateful to be out of Egypt. And then it was like, oh, Egypt was so wonderful. Oh, they had leeks, they had food. Why did God bring us here? To starve us to death? And we can identify with the fact. I've had so many people say, I'm frustrated with my family member or a friend or whatever who had a powerful conversion experience and then just seemed to kind of walk away from it. And then again, that's part of that whole wilderness moment. Will we engage what we have been told we are, which is God's children, and the reality is, we are connected. The question is, can we live into knowing that? And so for most of us, when we begin in prayer, we talked a little bit about this yesterday on the program, but when you meet a young couple like 15 or 16 or 17 and they talk about how much they love somebody and they say, oh, they meet all my needs. They meet all my needs. I love them so much. They meet all my needs. Well, that's okay. I mean, that's why we are attracted to people, right? But at the 50th wedding anniversary, I love you because you meet all of my needs. That doesn't look so good, right? Because it indicates that we haven't gone deeper into the relationship. And so what is happening, I think, in the wilderness experience spiritually is much like a pilot who has been operated during the daytime by visuals. But there comes a time when they may need to fly at night. And at night, you can't depend on what you see. You have to depend on your instruments. And so one of the things we're talking about tonight is the fact that in the wilderness experience for a praying person who's growing in their faith, is they have to start learning how to navigate faith when it feels like their relationship with God might not be as close as it once was. And the irony is, it's a sign that it's even closer. Because but that's something we kind of need to learn, and that's part of what we learn from our family stories of the scriptures. So this idea of the desert experience is where you go to be changed. And when you go into the wilderness, one of the things that happens in the wilderness is not everybody survives. And we're changed. People who go into those kinds of wilderness, Israel was different coming out of the Exodus than they were going in. And we are different when we go through, after we've gone through a wilderness experience. Because what we're learning is that something has to die in the wilderness in order for something else to be reborn. And so what the desert and the wilderness are all about, and remember, all true prophets always come from the wilderness, That's one of the signs of authenticity, that you're dealing with somebody who's a true prophet, is they've come through the wilderness. So this idea of understanding death and resurrection as part of the wilderness experience. There's a phrase that I really like, which is that the wilderness experience is that privileged time of spiritual growth. It's the time between dreams. It's the time between dreams. Because what happens in our life of faith is we start off, most of us start off with rote prayer. We learn to say grace. We learn to say the Our Father. When I was growing up in the Episcopal Church, I felt like it was you had to pray on your knees at night by your bed. That was something I thought was kind of expected. And so that discipline of saying these prayers, now, I didn't always have what I would call a super emotional experience doing that, but it was a discipline, right? And so what happens is that we move, and people who are in that stage of prayer, there's nothing wrong with rote prayer. You know, the prayers we say in liturgy, the prayers that we repeat with other people, those are great. I mean, they're good. But what we're talking about here is, you know, just think about when you get a card from an insurance company or something, and it just says, you know, happy holidays from, you know, Mass Mutual or whatever. Versus when somebody, you know, your grandchild writes you a note and says something like, I just loved the way you made those brownies for me, or something like that. One of them is intimate, right? And one of them is sort of impersonal. And so as we grow in faith, one of the things we're learning how to do is to relate to God in a more personal way, and where God knows us and we know God. And this is a stage of really where we go from knowing to loving. Now, one example that I would give is that, for instance, when I grew up, I knew that we were related to Aunt Harriet. You know, Aunt Harriet was my aunt. Uncle Eldon was my uncle. I knew that. But until I didn't deny the fact that it existed, a lot like I accept the fact that there are pyramids in Egypt, but I've never been, I haven't seen it for myself, right? Well, what we do when we move from rote prayer into opening up to more loving of God and a more intimate relationship with God is that we're beginning to, as we get to know God, we are learning how to relate to each other because we know each other better. You know, for instance, at our dinner table tonight, we were making connections. We were saying, oh, I know so-and-so, did you meet them? You know, oh, this is where you live, this is where I live. And again, we were starting this process of beginning to get to know each other. And that's what we're doing in prayer. We are beginning to get to know each other. And authentic prayer, as far as I'm concerned, is when we can be vulnerable with God as we are. And when we basically understand that God loves us at least as much as the person who loves us the most. So, you know, and one of the things I think is really important in the life of prayer is to get super grounded in that experiential belief that God loves me. And, you know, for psychological reasons, for many reasons, we can have a really hard time taking that in. But that's where we say to God, I need you to help me experience your love. Because one of the things, again, in Christianity is that we grow in faith by not becoming more and more large and in charge, but by becoming more and more humble and just as I am, without one plea. That's real Christian maturity. Because it's the confidence to make it about God and not about ourselves. Any comments or questions about that? Okay, so this idea of getting to know God is a process. And this is where, when we were talking about what we would be looking at in terms of the Christian take on wilderness, is that one of the things we learned, as we learned from our family story of the Exodus, is that God guided Israel as a pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire by night. And so God is in the darkness of the day, and then God is in light at night. And so think about that. What it's really saying is that God is there in the unlikely and the contrary.
That's interesting.
So the moments when we feel like everything is falling apart, how many of you have heard people say, you know, I don't know if you're going to believe me when I tell you this, but cancer was the best thing that ever happened to me. Or, you know, my life really started when I recognized that there's a God and it ate me, in a 12-step recovery. In other words, the times that we think are our greatest failure are where God basically becomes most connected, most alive. And so this is where we can have our Christian hope that people who might be experiencing great pain, but they aren't experiencing it alone. And what they're learning how to do is be aware of God's presence. I think when people are beginning to pray, I don't think they can really necessarily know if they're experiencing God's presence or not. Because you have to start experiencing it to sort of learn what it feels like. How many, if you take your hands like this and put them close enough together, can you feel some heat exchange or energy between them? Yeah. Okay. Well, see, so what's going on is there's a connection here, but we have to start being aware of it before, we didn't invent that feeling of heat or energy between our hands, right? It was there all along. But until we become aware of it, we don't notice it. Well, a lot of what we're talking about is learning how God is communicating with us all the time. But we need to learn how God communicates. And so one of the things about Christianity, a lot of people think Christianity is about how good we are. Christianity is about relationship. It's about relationship. And even when the Godhead is describing God's own presence, it's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's always relationship. And it's not only relationship with God, but with other people. And so it's not so much about techniques, but about relationship. However, having said that, there are things, I remember in Nebraska, we had massive blizzards when I was growing up. And one of the things that was a real issue is that blizzards were so intense that you could literally get lost on my grandparents' ranch, between the house and the barn. So what people would do is they tie a rope between the house and the barn, so you could feel your way to the barn and feel your way back. Because otherwise, you really can't tell by what's going on around you. And so these prayer techniques that we're talking about are in many ways like that. They're like a rope that gives us a way of navigating. And this is, Sylvia's just having to work his.
That's all right.
Okay. One of the things that we talked about was learning a little bit about centering prayer. Centering prayer comes from a long tradition of Christianity, probably beginning most authentically with The Cloud of Unknowing, written by an unknown author in the 14th century. And God Almighty, visual aids. Okay, it's right on the floor, just where you want it. Okay, so what happens when we go to prayer is that our thoughts are all stirred up. We sit down to pray and think, oh, did I turn that silencer on or not? Hello, Jesus. Is that somebody at the door? No, I don't think. No. Did I? No. I'm sorry, Jesus. We try to get back into that place. And again, what I'm suggesting is that centering prayer is essentially allowing the mind to come to stillness. And depending on how much debris is in the water, how much mental stuff is going on in your head, it can take a long time. It can take almost 20 minutes, or it can happen almost right away. But it's hard to pray unless you come to some sort of stillness. So real prayer begins from this place of stillness. And so something like centering prayer, the way that centering prayer approaches this is that, now, some people find it's very useful to have a prayer space in their home. Maybe it's just a chair, maybe it's a plant, maybe it's a cross, a Bible, whatever. But it's a place where when you go there, you think, I am going here to pray. In other words, it's kind of giving your body and your mind a clue that this is what we're doing now. And sound is also something that is very, very powerful. For some people, it helps to have music in the background. For some people, they would prefer silence. Okay? But these are tones that are basically, for instance, when you sit down to pray, and usually it's thought to be wise to sit down and to have your back as straight as possible, and to just have your feet both on the floor. And something, these tones, as you're listening to this, try to sit up straight. And take in a deep breath, deep enough that you can feel your belly coming out a little bit. And as you are basically coming into this time of silence, what centering prayer does is whenever a thought comes to your head, you know, is that the dog at the door? You know what I'm saying? You know how these things. Instead of saying, oh, I shouldn't be thinking that, what you do is you take a word. And usually it's a word that pulls you into your sense of relationship with God. It could be Abba, it could be love, it could be Jesus, it could be Yeshua, it could be any of these names so what happens is that when a thought comes into your mind, rather than trying to push it away, you just say the word. And so if your mind is very, very busy, it might be Yeshua, 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 Yeshua. And as the water begins to still, it may be more like Yeshua. Yeshua. And so what happens is that just as this water is becoming more clear, the mind will eventually come to clearness. And what this centering prayer is really based on is the fact that when we are present to God as we are and as God is in this relationship, God can change us without necessarily the use of language between us. And so in the same way that, let's say that you were going in for, to have your appendix out, and you wake up in the recovery room and they say, well, when are they going to do the operation? And they said, well, they've already done it. You said, well, they couldn't have. I don't remember anything. Well, look at your side. Can you see the bandages? Something was happening while you were put to sleep. And there are stages in prayer where literally, and this is again the kind of thing, in the classic language, we talked about the purgative way, the illuminative way, and the unitive way. And the purgative way begins again with our understanding of our brokenness and our need for healing. And then the illuminative way comes from this deeper knowing of God, knowing our family stories, knowing how God is and who God is, and trusting God. And the unitive way is again when there is this tremendous sense of intimacy, where the human person and God become so connected that they literally are united as one. Okay? So the idea of centering prayer is to present yourself without using words and allowing God to operate directly on the soul. But what's happening is that you will notice that during the day, you begin to have a more heightened awareness to other things that happen, little grace things that happen. You know what I'm talking about, where you're looking for a parking space and all of a sudden one opens up, and it's like, thank you, Jesus. Or, I forgot this, and I did forget it. Yeah, I forgot it's in the back of my, it's in the bottom of my purse. Thank you, God. But there's this beginning to have more of a knitting together of the way that God speaks in text and in our everyday moments and experience. One of the important teachings of Christianity as well is our teachings about forgiveness. Forgiveness is important, especially because if we are compartmentalizing something about our life, if we've got a secret from God, just like if we had a secret with our spouse or whatever, it makes it hard for us to wholly give ourselves to the relationship. And so, this is a place where, with an appropriate person, in confession or we have the general confession, of course, every Sunday, but basically where we start in AA, they talk about having, looking at what we've done, having an inventory. Again, because our secrets, there's a phrase in AA, we're only as sick as our secrets. And the same thing is true. We're only as sick as our secrets.
Thank you.
And one of the things about forgiveness is that, here's God up here, and here's me. And I found out about that liquor store, and I just found it irresistible, and I had to rob the liquor store. Shouldn't have done it, but I did, So what happens is I go and I say to God, I'm sorry, I won't do that again. What happens is we ask forgiveness. And then pretty soon, inevitably, what goes on is we do something else. We yelled at one of the kids, right? One of my favorite stories was a woman who was working very hard on her prayer life, and she came in, she was laughing, and she goes, well, I think I'm making some progress, but she goes, some things have gone a little awry. She said, I actually was in my bedroom praying, and I heard the kids making noise, and I yelled, shut up, I'm trying to pray! She said it just didn't have that feeling of Christ love, if you know what I'm talking about. So we say, okay, I'm sorry, I lost my temper, whatever. So we ask forgiveness, and then we do something else that we shouldn't. And so what happens with each one of these breaks in relationship and then the coming back together? The string, or the distance between where we started from and God just gets closer and closer, right? And so what happens is, this is why when people say that God is so close to sinners, because they know they're broken, they know they need. And they come to God not with what, you're so lucky to have me for a friend. Let's do lunch tests instead, Go help somebody who really needs help. I'm doing pretty well. I mean, I may not be the best, but I'm not the worst either. Okay, that attitude is not where we need to go, right? So this idea of getting closer and closer through our own understanding of our brokenness. At the time of Vatican II, the Roman Catholic Church was considering replacing the language of sin with healing. So when we talk about I have sinned, replacing it with the understanding of I need healing. And so one of the other things that, and Christian forgiveness is way more complicated than we can really get into tonight. But just a couple of observations. First of all, it's critical to understand that we don't forgive things that have happened to us. First of all, if it was nothing, we could just let it go. Somebody bumps into you in the hall, they say, oh, excuse me. And you go, oh, forget it. Or forgive me. And you say, oh, nothing of it. It doesn't take anything. But when we have really been wounded, We want to let it go, but we can't. We're hooked. It's like what they did has hooked us in some way. And so Christian forgiveness is about letting go of that connection to the pain and saying, I give it to God because I would rather be in the presence of the God who loves me than thinking and obsessing and ruminating and resenting what has already happened, something I can't change. Because when something has already happened, you can't go back and change it, but you can change how you think about it. And so when we say, and so it's not saying, oh, I'm sure it wasn't really their fault. I think it probably was. I mean, and one of the sad things is that the people who hurt us are frequently not the ones who are ending up healing us. But that's one of the beauties of our faith, is that God can heal us, and it's not making excuses, it's not denying it, it's not minimizing it, none of that. But it's just saying, I don't want to be connected to somebody else who hurt me. I want to be connected to the God who loves me. And so you deal with them, God, the way you need to deal with them, and you deal with me the way you need to deal with me. And this could take quite a while. I mean, you might find yourself turning it over, as they say. Oh, you know, I had there was a teacher of one of my children, and for whatever reason, what happened between us was just terribly painful for me. And it was to the point where even just driving by the school made me feel terrible. And, but it, you know, and it took a couple years for me to really let God heal that. But I got to that place by just refusing to let it take up too much real estate in my head. And so when I would think of this person, think about what happened, I would just immediately say, God, I need your love. I need your healing. And again, this is where our ability to visualize and to use our heart and mind and our soul to connect to God is one of those ropes through the wilderness, right? So one of the things that's important to understand too is that we can only understand God so much with our head. There's a limit to what we understand about God. God is beyond the beyond. So, but we can understand many things and we can grow in our understanding, but there's a limit. And there's a limit to how much we can feel. You know, we can come to church and we can have just glorious senses of spiritual consolation and almost bliss and a sense of real joy. But, you know, when it comes to our ability to feel all the time at that level, our hearts are limited, our minds are limited. But one of the things that we can do is we can use our will. We can commit our will to, I trust you, I'm growing in my prayer, I want your love, I desire your love, give me more of a desire. You know, I'm trusting you. It's like that peekaboo thing. I may not see you right now, I may not feel you right now, but I know you're there, and I trust you. And so we're saying, even when our minds can't take it in, even when our hearts are hurting or wounded or feeling God's distance, or God's presence, either one, we can continue to use our will to choose, I want to be with you. Do you remember in the garden where Jesus says, could you not wait with me 1 hour? We can choose to place ourselves with God. And we can choose to place ourselves with human beings who are in pain and suffering. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we feel great about it all the time. It doesn't necessarily mean that we completely understand what's going on all the time. But the will can keep us in connection. One of the things that is another way of, another rope in the blizzard is to study Scripture in a way. Lectio Divina. How many of you have heard of Lectio Divina?
Of what?
Oh, Lectio Divina. Yeah. It's something that has been talked about a great deal in the last few years, and there are other. Lectio Divina is a different kind of Bible study. It's not like reading the newspaper. for information. It's not like when we study the Bible and we say, when was this written? To what group was it written? What was the purpose of this, right? It's not like that. We take even just a small phrase. And Psalm 139 is an excellent source for Lectio Divina if you want to try this yourself. What you do is you just read it very slowly, and it's like sucking on hard candy. And you just let the words come to you. And if something gives you a little bit, if it draws your heart either towards or away, you stop. And you say, what are you saying to me here, God? You know, we might be reading, like, you are the apple of my eye. And you're thinking, well, that sounds nice, but I'm not feeling that right now. Then that's a good place to stop and say, God, there's something within me. I want to accept that this is true, but there's something that's blocking my ability to take this in. Could you help me to speak to me through what you're trying? Speak to me. Heal this part of who I am. Or you might discover a tremendous sense of consolation in something you read. I was talking about this not too long ago with someone, and we were doing Psalm 139, and the phrase came back to her of something that happened when her mother was dying when she was 12. And she said it was like, you know, sort of the sky opened up, just this phrase. And that's what Lectio can do. It can basically open up windows of understanding. And usually the appropriate amount of time for prayer with something like Lectio is probably about 15 minutes, 10 minutes. And what you can do then is journal if you had any insights. And if, like I said, if there was something that bothered you, then you stop there and you say, God, help me with this. Let me understand. And if it's something that comforts you, you just notice that and you're grateful. And so Lectio Divina is something that many people in the church, in monasteries and convents and in religious life, they would do Lectio as part of their daily practice. And then at the end of the day, what we can do is we can look back over the day, and we can go through the day and look at all the different things that happened. And we could say, how did I experience God's presence? Or how did I experience God's absence? Okay? And one thing we might notice is, boy, you know, from the time I went to work till the time I got home, I really didn't think about God at all. So I'm not very connected in my work life right now to God's presence. Mm-hmm. You know, one of the examples that comes to my mind, I don't know about you, but when you get stuck in traffic and you've got to be someplace, you know, one of the things I used to do is watch the clock. Doesn't help. Yeah, you're just like, well, get later. And we're still stuck here. And I'm now getting later. And now, you know. And so instead, what I would do is just say, okay, I'm doing the best I can. Just be with me. And help me to enjoy this time I have with you. Well, yesterday what happened, when I was reviewing my day, I was so pleased that Sunil had invited me to be part of this program, Food for Thought. So, and I practiced getting on, because I'm not that good with technology. My name is Eileen, and I'm not good with tech. And I thought I had it. You know, I put my name in, and it says Enter Studio. I thought, okay, I'm good to go, I'm good to go. So at about 5 minutes of 12, I start trying to get on, and I can't get on. And try some more, and it's saying, your browser is blocking you. And I'm like, I'm sorry, whatever I did to offend you, browser. Please, let's be friends. And then all of a sudden it's noon, and I'm like, the program has started, and Sunil's waiting, and then Sunil calls me, and then he says, oh, this is Ben's phone number. And I'm like, oh, Ben, and I'm sorry, Sunil, but you know, I'm trying to connect with all these different things. And so I call up Ben, and Ben was like an angel. He was wonderful. He just said, you know, first of all, he was calm, you know, and he told me kind of what to do. But as a result, I was late getting on. Now this is though, when I looked at the experience, in the past, something like that would have made me feel really bad. I would have felt like a fool. I would have felt like I was letting people down. And I mean, then my mind is ticking. It's like, well, not only am I not showing up for people in Rhode Island, but this program goes all over the world. And so now it's an international incident that I'm late. But I was aware of just how truly touched I was by Sunil's patience, by Ben's patience, and I didn't feel bad. I felt like I was doing the best I could and that God was with me. And what I kept saying is, Eileen, this isn't about you. This is about God. And God uses weak, broken people all the time. And that's just the nature, that you're a sinner, saved by grace. This is your best effort.
That's right.
But, you know, if it fails, you know, I just have to admit that that's on, I'm sorry, but but that deep sense of peace, rather than becoming frantic. I mean, there was a day when I think under these circumstances, I would have tried to hide in my bedroom under the bed so Sunil could never find me. Eileen, weren't you supposed to be here at noon? But instead, I just felt a deep sense of peace. And I felt like the program was very graced.
It was graced.
It felt very healing and graced. And what it felt like was that the connection was not so much about my brokenness, about who you are, about who, it was just that connection of us supporting each other in Christ. And that deep sense of peace. So like, that's what I mean about and when I revisited that at night, I refelt all of that peace, all of that gratitude, and that deep reminder of, this isn't about you, Eileen. This is about God. Okay? Well, I want to thank everybody for, one of the other things we're not going to really have time to go into tonight too much, but this idea of visualization, guided imagery, things like that. If you're having problems with your prayer, one thing you can do is to try to put your prayer, try to put your feelings into a picture. Like picture that it might be that you're in a very peaceful, calm place and you just feel yourself in a sunlit meadow by some trees or by a stream. It might mean that you feel like you're on a beach and it's cloudy and cold and drizzly and there's some rusted car in front of you. And then you picture, that's how I feel. Then you say, who do I want to be with me in this? Is it God, Jesus? For some people it might be Mary. It would be the Holy Spirit. And what do I want? Do I want them to hold me? Do I want them to just walk with me? Do I just want to be heard? And what happens is that as you create this visualization, you start to become aware of the layers of your feeling. And then you invite God into that as a way of healing. Okay? The last thing I want to close with is a quote from Joan Chittister, who is a Benedictine nun. And she writes, "There is nothing easier in spirituality than to lead people down the path of prayer forms without ever asking what goes on inside of them as a result. At the end, consequently, it is possible to get a praying person. It is not always possible to get a spiritual person. Praying people get their prayers in and wait for God somehow miraculously to deliver them from their private demons. Spiritual people expect the demons. What they look for is a way to find God even there." Thank you so much for your attention.
Can we ask questions?
Sure, absolutely.
Folks, I know that you're all filled with questions. I know I am. I just love, and maybe I love when you first talked about the wilderness, about election, about choice. The choice to be in this relationship, the choice to nurture it, the choice it's an act of will. I love that concept.
I think one thing that's important to understand too is that as we grow in the spiritual life, very rarely are we tempted to do bad things, really. I mean, I'm joking about the liquor store. Please tell the Westerly police that was a big joke if anything is happening. But what we're tempted to do is choose between the good and the better. That's where our discernments come in. You know, we've got two good things to do. You know, I'd like to take my family out to a restaurant. I'd like to support the local homeless shelter. I've got $20 I didn't expect to have, right? They're both good things to do. It's not like one is wrong and one is right, but there's a good and the better. You know, like when people are choosing, say, what they're going to do for a Lenten penance. If you hate food, say, well, I'm going to give up desserts for Lent. Oh, big sacrifice. You don't like it anyway. You know? I always felt like a cheater because in Nebraska we never got fish. And I loved it during Lent because we had fish on Fridays. So I was always kind of happy during Lent. But I guess what I'm saying is that we have to look at what is, you know, the good and the better. And that's where we ask God to guide us. And again, what Jesus is being asked to do in the desert is, or in the wilderness is, he's being asked to do good things. Feed the hungry. You know, change the government from on high. Make it people's lives better, right? But he has to choose instead to prefer what God prefers. And that's what this process of learning to go from knowing to loving God is about, is preferring God and preferring what God prefers.
That makes me think of, maybe you can say something about this, about activism versus a contemplative life. You know, there's often this debate, well, there's people that just, you know, praying all the time and sitting in monasteries. What do they really do? And then there are the activists that don't pay any attention. And I think it's somehow two sides of the same coin, but maybe you can explain it.
You're absolutely right, and frequently the story of Mary and Martha comes up.
Okay.
And I think what's important to understand is that I believe that prayer is what undergirds true activism. If we are authentically praying, we are going to be led into having more compassion for other people. Norman Lear, I saw an interview with him, and he had a bumper sticker I thought was great. On his bumper sticker it said, "Just another version of you." In other words, once we start realizing that God is in other people, that we are created in the image and likeness of God, and as we start to love people more broadly, we should invest according to what we have to offer. But this is the thing, we have different gifts that we bring, and both are important, and it's a mistake to make one right and wrong. They feed each other. And my experience with activists is they get heartbroken and discouraged unless they have some kind of support. And this really goes back to another problem that's a little bit beyond us for tonight. But essentially, there are two primary ways that we go to God. One is via positiva. That's basically God through images, and then via negativa. And so for one person, the best way they can worship is maybe in a charismatic prayer group, or, you know, with the music and the hands and the telling of stories and testimonies, and this is what God is doing in my life. And that's more God through images. And our liturgy uses senses and awareness and images. Senses, all the time, you know, visual, reading, images, words. Via negativa is more that experience where we experience God's presence most profoundly in silence. And by, you know, outside at night under the stars, that kind of thing. And both of them lead us to a complete relationship with God, but they're just different paths toward the same thing. And it has to do with the way we were created in our temperament.
Question on wilderness, and I know the church is considering doing a retreat. Is that a way of entering? I've never been on a retreat, so I have no idea what actually occurs. But is that a way of entering a wilderness or entering a relationship? I mean, how does the retreat work with wilderness?
I think what the way I would interpret it is that, if tonight we're going to bed or whatever, we say, I desire for you to know you as you are. St. Francis's big prayer was, who are you, God, and who am I? Who are you, God, and who am I? And so, and you say, tomorrow, help me to see ways I can draw closer to you. Show me.
It's a retreat.
Well, what I'm saying is, so you start doing that every day, and retreats are simply one thing you can do. But it's not like, in other words, it's one more methodology. It's kind of like going to a vigil service or reading a book. There are just different things we can do, and retreats are a wonderful way. One of the things that retreats do for us is they disconnect us from our busy lives. And that helps us, because remember I said you have to come to stillness? And one of the first things a lot of people do at retreat is sleep. Because they're tired. Sleep. Because we rush around to get ready so we can go on retreat, right? And then we get there and it's like, and it's a chance to basically focus on a relationship with God. But what I'm saying is it's part of the path that we can embrace. And I would hardly recommend doing it. Especially Frank Rizzo is wonderful. He's a deeply prayerful. And so I would say that's a way that God can use. But what I'm trying to also say is to just keep every day saying, how many ways, how many times today could I connect with you? If you could show me. And the prayer that is always appropriate is, give me a deeper desire for you. Deepen my love for you. Deepen my desire for you. Because our desires are what we're nailed to. If we want to be famous, if we want to be rich, we're nailed to that because we have to make choices consistent with what's going to make us famous and what's going to make us rich. And so what we're saying is, God, take me away from false attachments and attach my heart to you. So that my desire is for you, because that will free me, not trap me.
When you mentioned in Eccentric Prayer about having a word to use to deal with thoughts, that is the same concept as having a mantra?
It's a very similar thing, and it has made a lot of people very suspicious of Eccentric Prayer. That it's somehow or another some New Age thing or some non-traditional practice. But really, it's a very similar thing. I think the difference is that when we use the word, the prayer word or whatever, it's usually to establish the relationship we have, like Yeshua or love or whatever. And so it's really, again, focusing on not so much bringing us to a more psychological wholeness. A lot of Eastern religion is really spiritual psychology. Does that make sense? Where you learn to let go of things, not too attached, and you won't get so much pain. That kind of thing. So, but Christianity is about relationship. And so I would say that's the difference. It's more than just about in meditation. Some people meditate simply to bring themselves to greater peace and calm. And Eccentric Prayer is designed to open us up to God's ability to transform us from within.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if that will lead to a different kind of life. My niece, who lives in Germany, just sent us this video of a meditation person, and she said something like, if you get upset about watching the news, just don't watch it. If the war, whatever war, doesn't happen in your backyard, it's none of your business. And the idea was to be more peaceful. And we both had a reaction to that. It's like, but doesn't God want us to care about the world and and feel with people who are in pain and misery, and rather than just pretend it didn't exist? So I don't know.
That is one of the differences. That's Christianity tells us that whatsoever we have done to the least of these, we have done to Jesus. And so if I know that there's something wrong, if there's injustice, if there's somebody in pain, I willfully choose not to look at that. I am denying the Christ in that.
Right.
Now, other no wisdom, but it is also true that we have to recognize our own limits.
Right.
So, for instance, if we find ourselves feeling overwhelmed or helpless, or starting to get depressed, or feeling like we're out of control, that's where, again, when we start feeling like it's all up to us.
Okay, right.
You know, there's an injustice. I get closer to it, I solve it in a back way, the idea is, again, to bring God's, what would you have me do? Soren Kierkegaard had a phrase, there are many good things to do, what would you have me do, God?
That makes sense.
And we all have limitations. You know, when I give money to UNICEF, I'm not giving it to the American Cancer Society.
Yeah.
You know, that's just with those choices. Again, these are the good and better choices we're making. Any other comments or questions?
I think that the good and better balance is a good way to define where to go.
Yes.
Because good and better are both good things.
Right.
You're not choosing between a negative and a positive.
And that's where we basically just have to be obedient as we understand it. And if I've got this wrong, show me how to do it better, God.
I've heard it taken at 3 levels, good, better, and best. What is the best thing to do?
Oh, you know what? The problem with that one for me is, again, it puts the focus back on my performance. Because I don't know about you, but when I was in elementary school, if there was a gold star and a gold star and a plus, I wanted a gold star and a plus. And so we basically, instead of keeping our eyes on, I'm a sinner in need of grace and I'm just grateful. You know, really for many years, my daily prayer was, thank you, Jesus, I just don't want to kill anybody today. I thought that was a good goal. I mean, rather than get too high flying about my personal agendas for how holy I'm going to be, you know, it's like, please don't help me. I don't want to hurt anybody today. Yeah, that's not about, but can you see where it's grounding us in humility? And the farther we go in the spiritual life, the more we get close to the ground. And that's where, again, the wilderness experience is about God being in the contraries.
Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the Most High God, have mercy on me, a sinner.
The Jesus prayer is something I didn't include tonight. That comes more in the Eastern and Western Christian traditions. The Hezekiah tradition is more in the Eastern, and it's personally one of my most important practices. I absolutely love the Jesus prayer. And the idea is to pray without ceasing. And if you've ever read Franny Zooey Salinger's book, Franny talks about the Jesus prayer. Basically, it's where you literally say, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Then what you do is eventually shorten it because to Jesus' mercy or whatever. And I pray with beads, but you do it basically non-stop. And so what you eventually do is try to get with every beat of your heart, you're praying Jesus' mercy. And I learned this practice in a monastery setting, and you know, it's a process to kind of learn how to do the Jesus prayer. But I ended up with brain surgery, and I was in the Lindeman hospital, and I was in the neurosurgery intensive care unit, and in the middle of the night, I heard a nurse scream, and I thought, nurses never scream.
Oh, wow.
And all of a sudden I heard, Jesus, mercy, Jesus, mercy, Jesus, mercy. And what had happened is the, or what do you call it, the
Carotid artery?
carotid artery, the line had come out.
Oh.
And so my carotid artery was spurring, and so literally what woke me up was I heard Jesus mercy first, and then I heard her scream. And I realized it was exactly synchronized with the blood. So this blood is now going to another bed. I mean, it was that far away. And it was just like, Jesus mercy, Jesus mercy. And I thought it had actually happened. And so yeah, it's a very powerful practice.
Folks, this is amazing, right? And Eileen, thank you so much for this. This is really good. So you might all have other questions, but I want to leave because it's around 8:15 now. We want to try and stop the program at this time. But if you have any specific questions, you could always talk to Eileen. And Eileen, maybe we could even do some more programming together. I think that would be really good. One of the things I forgot to mention at the very beginning is that Eileen is a spiritual director. She is a spiritual director for many priests in our diocese and many other people. And so she meets with people and talks with them, helps them in their relationship with God, and so that they can experience it in a more fuller way. And so, Eileen, just thank you for being here. Thank you for being in Westerly. Thank you for being a priest in the diocese. I really appreciate it. Thank you for being our friend. Thank you for also reminding them when I put them to sleep on my sermons, it's actually a good thing.
My husband once said, when he came home from church, I said, how's the sermon? He goes, I said, what do you mean? He goes, oh, I think I was just putting people to sleep. I said, oh, honey, I'm sure it wasn't that bad. What do you mean? He goes, no, I mean...
Really?
I said, gotcha. Yeah.
Folks, thank you again. For next week, what we have is Jezebel Landau, who is the Hebrew professor at Hartford Seminary. He'll be coming, and this guy is amazing too. He's been involved in the Jewish-Palestinian dialogue in the 1990s, and so he's pretty amazing. So please do come and join us for next week as well. Thanks a lot.